We kick off the show tonight by talking about the ongoing fallout from the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. David Cameron over the weekend responded to that news, which has been widely alleged, of course, to be a state-backed assassination, by saying there needed to be consequences for Vladimir Putin. What I want to talk to you about is what those consequences should be. Is it your view that for too long, this country, the West more generally perhaps, has been far too lenient, far too soft, far too weak even, when it comes to the unpredictable, brutal tyrant that is currently in the Kremlin? We all know the danger that Putin poses. And yet it seems to me that, of course, while we need to be careful of not starting World War III, quite literally, there is scope. And indeed, there is an imperative on us to take a harder line when it comes to Russia. Putin does what he does because he knows that he can get away with it. There was Litvinenko, there were the Salisbury poisonings, there was the annexation in Crimea. And on almost all those occasions, the response was what I think can only be described as soft, that you might say actually was weak. Then you come to the invasion of Ukraine. I think the only real act of violence and aggression on the part of Vladimir Putin that has been really met with any sort of sizable response. The seizing of Russian assets, the economic sanctions, the support for Ukraine. You can't say that amounts to nothing. And yet even that seems to be running out of speed. Even now we seem to be, as we were talking on this show about last week, questioning how long we can continue to support Ukraine. The US government struggling even to pass the money and the legislation it needs to continue that support. And it all adds up, doesn't it, to a sign of weakness on the part of the West when it comes to Vladimir Putin and how to deal with it. This man is an aggressor. This man is a bully. This man is an ideologue wedded to the idea of rebuilding the USSR and expanding Russia's power and territory. The only way to deal with bullies, even those with nuclear weapons, is to stand up to them, isn't it? Now, of course, I say it again, we have to be careful, we had to tread carefully. But I don't think the West is necessarily getting its approach to Russia quite right. And you can be absolutely certain that if Donald Trump becomes president once again, that approach is going to get a whole lot softer because he does not want to know. When it comes to toughness and standing up to Russia, he doesn't want a bit of it. So when David Cameron says there needs to be consequences to the death, alleged murder of Alexei Navalny, and you heard a minute ago his widow alleging today that he was poisoned with Novichok, the same substance that was used in Salisbury, dare I need remind you, what should those consequences be? Or is this just going to be yet another instance of Western politicians talking the talk, sounding tough, and actually not walking the walk? Of when it comes to tough action designed to punish and deter Putin from doing what Putin does, is it just going to be another missed opportunity? It's interesting, isn't it, that David Cameron is effectively leading the UK's response to this as our relatively new Foreign Secretary. David Cameron, the man who, admittedly, not alone and with other foreign leaders, I think failed woefully to rise to the moment when Russia invaded Crimea back in, it was 2014, I think. Woefully failed, paved the way for the war that we've seen in Ukraine and the deaths of the thousands upon thousands of people, many of them completely innocent, who have lost their lives in that conflict. Because if David Cameron and his fellow world leaders had shown an ounce of courage, an ounce of grit and backbone when Vladimir Putin had a go at annexing some Ukrainian territory, do we really think he would have made the decision to try to annex almost all of Ukrainian territory? So maybe David Cameron's learned, let's be generous, maybe David Cameron has learned his lessons. I hope that when he says there will be consequences, he's not just talking about a war of words and another slap of the wrist. Does the West need to get tough with Putin? Or do you think the absolutely legitimate concern about full-blown nuclear war, prodding the bear, provoking a conflict with this guy, justifies the extreme caution, to put it generously, that I think the West has treated Vladimir Putin with for quite a long time. What should David Cameron and Rishi Sunak be doing? If you were in charge in this country, what sort of approach would you take to Russia and to Vladimir Putin? We talk a lot, don't we, about Ukraine. Should we keep funding it? What should we do? But really, the far bigger question here is, how do we deal with a guy who is intent on destabilising our country, intent on undermining the entirety of Western civilization, and thinks, with good reason to be honest, that he can do whatever he wants in his own country, completely free of consequence? How would you respond to that if you were in charge in our country? What would you do? What should the UK and the West do when it comes to Vladimir Putin? Because you might be of the view that the answer to that question is very little. That what parts of Ukraine he wants to waltz in and annex is a matter for him and the people of Ukraine. That if he wants to allegedly murder opposition leaders in Russia, that's nothing to do with us. We've got more than enough problems here of our own. Maybe that's your view.
Yeah, what I want to say is I grew up in cosmopolitan Bradford, and my best mate was a lad called Vladimir Lichmanenko. And he was of Ukrainian descent. Sadly, he's passed away over the last few years. But he told me then in the late 60s, early 70s, that there was a fault line across Ukraine. One half of Ukraine was very pro-Russian, and the other half wasn't. I think if I knew that, I'm sure that the Pentagon and us in the West should have known that we were taking a step too far by trying to get Ukraine on our side and taking the borders of NATO further to Russia.
But Ukraine wasn't in NATO, Amjad, was it? It still isn't.
Yeah, that is the intention. I think they've now accepted NATO's.
But that was after the invasion.
Intention.
Sorry, I've got
it.
Yeah, that was after Putin invaded, though, wasn't it?
Putin knew that was the intention. That's why he did what he did. He's a proud Russian. We should have known that. We shouldn't have poked the bear. That's what we've done.
So you blame the West for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine?
I think that we should be more cleverer than what we've done in Ukraine. I think also we in Britain especially have to cut the cloth according to what we can afford. We've got potholes everywhere. Our national health service has failed, and yet we're being very, very expansive.
So we're
not an imperial power anymore. We don't rule the waves.
Amjad,
we don't rule the waves. We shouldn't be involved, in my view. We
shouldn't be standing up to the man who, perhaps more than any other, threatens our security and our way of life because there's potholes we could be fixing instead. That's the priority?
If that's the case, then why aren't we standing up against another psychopath in the Middle East called Netanyahu?
God's honest truth, because he's not a threat to us.
Oh, is he not?
Not in the same way as Putin is.
He could bring the whole temple down on our heads with what he's doing. There could be World War III. The whole of the Muslim world is incensed by what he's doing. And you're saying he's not a threat?
I'm saying he's not a threat to the UK because Israel, of course, is a British ally. That's why Rishi Sunak is not taking the same approach with Israel as with Russia, because Russia is an enemy, or at least a threat, and Israel is an ally.
But why have we made it an enemy? Why?
We haven't.
Why is he an enemy? Listen.
No, I'm not going to listen. I'm sorry, you've had your say. I'm going to respond to it. We haven't made it an enemy. Vladimir Putin has an ideology of rebuilding the USSR, rebuilding Russia's role in the world. You let him off the hook. You excuse and justify what he does when you suggest that we have made him an enemy, rather than him being a natural enemy of the West because he hates the West, what it stands for, and he sees it as a threat to his plans for a new great Russia. He has made himself an enemy. We haven't made him one.
The USSR does not exist, but Russia has always been a superpower and will always remain a superpower.
But it's not, is it? It's not a superpower.
Remember, the Russians defeated Napoleon. The Russians single-handedly defeated Hitler, right? Don't tell me that they should be put in a box and that we can defeat them.
The Russians single-handedly defeated Hitler.
Listen, up to 1943-44, that was the only front that was active against Hitler.
So all the Brits
on the sideline. It was D-Day took place.
Do you realise how offensive you're being? to the British people that lost their lives?
I'm being a realist. I'm
no,
not.
hold on. Let me.
Amjad.
Amjad. If you keep talking over me, we can't have a conversation. When you say Russia single-handedly took on Hitler, how offensive is that to the British lives that were lost, the American lives that were lost, the French lives that were lost, trying to defeat the threat the Nazis posed? The idea that Russia did it single-handedly is historically absurd, sir.
Could you include the 1.4 million Muslims who fought for the Allies?
Absolutely.
Against it.
You're the one that's claiming they didn't.
You forgot the Muslims. You forgot them.
You're the one that's claiming Russia did it single-handedly, Amjad.
Came to fight for this war, and you
Absolutely.
think that I'm offending you.
I think you're the ones. You are absolutely historically wrong to say that Russia fought the Nazis single-handedly. Completely and utterly factually wrong, I'm afraid.
Russia paid the biggest price of anybody in the Second World War.
That's not what you said, is it? You said they fought Hitler single-handedly, and it's just wrong.
Am I wrong that up to 1944-43, they were the only front in Europe was against Hitler? We didn't do D-Day until 1944.
But
so I'm
what
right
about all the
you're
British?
wrong.
What about the British lives that were the British involvement in World War II didn't start in D-Day, Amjad, did it? It started in 1939.
Well, listen, how many soldiers were lost?
But Amjad, I've got to leave it there because we're going to the news, but you've totally changed your point. You are now backpedaling frantically on your claim that Russia single-handedly defeated Hitler, because I'm afraid so. The most basic reading of what happened in World War II would show that's just not the case. Catherine's the first-time caller in Folkestone. Catherine, hi.
Hello, hi. So it's really hard to disagree with your arguments, and it's hard to disagree with the Major General, who clearly knows an awful lot more behind the scenes than I do. But I'm just speaking as an everyday citizen with no bunker. And the way I see it, it's very unwise to push Putin any further than we already have. He's not on our borders yet, not in our territory. When you're dealing with a big bear, which I've never had to, you don't want to befriend it because you can't trust it, but you also don't want to bait it. So the tactic I would use if I was confronted with a literal big grizzly bear would be to keep as far away as I could from a safe vantage point and watch to see if it does advance on my territory, and if it advances on my territory, then I'd go guns blazing.
With a bear?
Well, perhaps not. But the point,
I'd love to see that, Catherine.
I take your point. That we are a tiny little country now. We're not Great Britain anymore in the way that we were. We've only got about 200 nuclear warheads. They've got thousands. They have threatened us over 36 times in many different horrendous ways, such as sending an underwater drone to completely engulf, to put Ireland under the sea and send a nuclear wave across the whole of the country. Even if that's not possible, it's still a horrendous threat that could do a lot of damage. And furthermore, in England, we do not have a civil defence plan. In Finland, who are right on the border with Russia, they have enough bunkers. They have 900,000 bunkers in Helsinki, which is more than their population in that city. And we don't have any bunkers, not any public bunkers.
Not many, yeah.
So if you're going to get tough on Putin, you better make sure your populace has some kind of defense.
The thing is,
what do you mean get tough? How are you going to get tough on him? You tell me.
By doing what I was doing, increase funding for Ukraine and really start to ramp up those economic sanctions. I completely hear what you're saying. The last thing, of course, it's mad this needs saying, but it does. The last thing any of us want to do is provoke World War III. Your view, though, is that we are more likely to do that by standing up to Putin. I think that makes it less likely. Because the way that you deal with bullies like this is to look them in the eye and say, no, you are not going to do that. And if you do, you're not going to get away with it. I think Putin is a man who only responds to strength. Any sign of weakness, he will exploit it, I think.
Well, I think that because we don't know him personally, we don't really know how he's going to respond, and that's the danger, isn't it? The danger is that he might be totally insane, and that's what we're all worried about. And you said, should we be cautious? I'm simply ringing up to say, yes, I personally believe, from where I'm standing, that we should be cautious now because he's not on our borders yet. And I'm sceptical about whether he wants to take over the whole of Europe, of Western Europe. I'm sceptical about that.
But even if he's not, in that sense, the threat from Russia and Putin doesn't just mean him invading the UK, does it? There's the destabilisation, there's the cyber warfare, there's the disinformation.
I just say, you said, should we be cautious? I'm one of the people that's saying yes, big yes. I'm waving up my hand and I'm saying, let's be cautious. Yes, I'm on that side of it. We don't have any civil defence. You tell me, where is our civil defence?
And you're right, Catherine. You're absolutely right to be cautious. Any response to Russia has to have caution in mind. But I agree with you completely. I think the chances of aggression between the West and Russia get greater the more we allow Putin to get his way without consequence. He has to be shown that there will be a response to his actions. That, I think, is actually perversely, I know it sounds strange, but perversely how we end up de-escalating, because he backs down, then the West can back down too, and that's how things start to become. If we let him get away with it like we did in 2014, look where that got us.